Alright, day 47 video, getting close to the end, going in about an hour or so. Usually I film at the end of the day. Filming at the start today. Figured out the overtime thing, finally, with the help of Matt from Australia, who suggested something which made sense, and then I did the calculation, and the numbers came out correctly. First, shout out to Matt from Ohio. Dealt his tournament table. He was on the same monorail car with the famous Bill Tate going to the Westgate for Trooper Thursday a week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah, chatted a while. He was in the 10, 9 or the 10. I don't remember if we were 9-handed or 10-handed. He was in the seat on my right. And also shout out to Paul from Talking Stick, dealing the World Series this year, but a fixture in Talking Stick. I was on break and just sitting there during dinner break while all the players were gone, chatted with Paul for a minute, so shout out to Matt and Paul. Now, gonna get into the overtime thing. Here's what it is. The labor laws do a very bad job at explaining this. There's like really no explanation at all. I could see how this calculation can fit into the language of the labor laws, although I have no idea how someone would make the leap from reading the overtime rules to this calculation, but it doesn't exclude it, I guess. But this is what Matt suggested. If you think of every day not just as total hours, but as like non-overtime hours and overtime hours. Early in the week, you'll have some portion of your day be non-overtime hours and daily overtime. You get more than 8 in a day, daily overtime. But don't count those daily overtime hours towards your 40 hours for the week in order to trigger weekly overtime. So, made a bunch of PowerPoint slides. Think it'll be a lot easier to see visually, so let's go to the slides. Okay, orange background. Here's the table. So, row across the top is just going to be days of the week. So the day, the name doesn't matter. Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever. Just days, 1 through 7. Okay. The spacing might look a little weird. No, the spacing is perfect. You'll see at the end. Second row is going to be how many hours I worked each day. This is an example, not an actual week I worked. But in this example, and then the final 2 rows are going to be regular hours and overtime hours. And you'll see that I'm also going to separate overtime hours into 2 different categories: daily overtime hours and weekly. So let's put some numbers in here. Day 1 of the work week, I work 9 hours. Don't think of it as 9. Think of it as 8 plus 1. Because once I hit 8 hours, daily overtime is triggered. So my first 8 hours of day 1 are regular hours. I get paid the regular wage. Then the final hour of that day, I get paid my overtime wage because it's overtime. What type of overtime? It's daily overtime. Haven't hit 40 for the week. It's not weekly overtime, it's daily overtime. I worked more than 8 hours in one day. So when I'm thinking about weekly overtime now, I'm really not at 9 for the week so far, I'm at 8. Because I only worked 8 regular hours. So let's go to day number 2. Say I worked 10 hours. So think of this as 8 plus 2. 8 regular hours and 2 overtime hours. And what type of overtime? Also daily. I got more than 8 hours in the day, so it's 2 daily overtime hours. Let's say day 3 is identical to day 2. I worked 10 hours. So it's 8 plus 2 is how we're thinking about it. And the 2, again, daily overtime. Not weekly yet, daily overtime. And let's say day number 4 is identical to days 2 and 3. I work 10 hours. Think of it again, 8 plus 2, and the 2 is daily. Okay, now gets a little more interesting, slightly more complicated, but let's say on day 5, I work 7 hours. So, no daily overtime. I didn't break 8 hours in a single day, so think of this as 7 plus 0. 7 regular hours and 0 overtime hours. Didn't get more than 8 in a day, no daily overtime, so 0 down there. And before I go to day 6, let's look at this for a second. Let's look at total hours. 9 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 7 is 46. So 46 total hours worked for the week. Okay, now let's move that green box down a little bit. 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 7, 39 regular hours. Even though I worked 46 total, 39 hours I got paid my regular wage. 39 regular hours so far. And move that green box down a little bit more. 7 overtime hours. So that's the breakdown of the 46 total hours I've worked. 39 regular, 7 overtime. The 39 regular needs to get to 40 in order to trigger the weekly overtime. Okay, so now, and yeah, all those 7 overtime hours were daily overtime, not weekly yet. So now, let's get rid of all that. And day 6, how many hours do I work day 6? Let's say I work 7 hours. Okay, how are we viewing that 7? It's going to be 1 because I only needed 1 more hour to get to 40 for the week in terms of regular hours, this third row in the grid. And then, so there you go, 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 7 plus 1, 40. Now I'm at 40 hours for the week, hours in which I was paid my regular rate. And the other 6 are now overtime, not daily anymore, but 6 weekly overtime hours because I met the criterion of 40 regular hours for the week. Everything for the rest of the week now is going to be weekly overtime. So let's say on the final day of the week, day 7 of the week, I work 4 hours. It's going to be 0 plus 4. No regular hours. I'm beyond 40 for the week, but I get paid overtime for all these. They're not daily, but they're weekly. As soon as I work that first hour on day 6, everything else for the rest of the week, weekly, because I met the criterion, 40 hours for the week. So 4 hours of overtime on the final day of the week, and weekly overtime now. Beginning of the week, the overtime was daily when I was breaking 8 hours in a day, and then once I got to 40 regular hours for the week, at the end of the week, my overtime hours, we can label them weekly overtime hours. So I used, the laws don't explain this in the least, like I said, but I used this type of calculation. I went through all my data working so far for me, those first 3 pay periods. I have pay stubs and I have my data, and yeah, the numbers are almost exact. It's not like perfect, but it's very negligible, the difference. It's like when I say my total time on the clock for me and on the pay stub, it's like a difference of like 3 minutes or like 7 minutes. It was differences that small. So that must be how it's working. If you read the overtime statute, I have no clue how you would get from reading the statute to this calculation, but it makes sense conceptually. And then when Matt suggested it, I like tested it with all the data I had, and those numbers are coming out. So there you go. I will calculate it that way for the rest of my time, which is only, 1 more pay stub. I actually only have today and 3 more days of work at Orleans, but I know what's going on now. And if you want to know, a lot of people said, talk to someone, HR or payroll, about it. A lot of times in my life, my employer has been shorting me on pay. Bringing it up, and it's terrible that this is the way it is, bringing it up never leads to anything better happening. So, including the tournament tips, I was making way more than the amount that Orleans guaranteed me before I started. I really didn't want to bring this up to anybody. When I was like 16, I brought this up, and then just terrible things started happening after that. At UPS, I brought it up. Terrible things started happening after that. When I worked in IT, I took a trip. We were installing the software at a site, and they told me certain things would be reimbursed. And then when I came back from the trip, they changed their minds and said no, and it just got worse and worse. It's awful that employers love stealing from their employees, and they get away with it so often, but nothing good has ever come from it. So Orleans, the paychecks from Orleans were way more, and it also wasn't that I thought the whole time something like malicious was going on. Figured just parsing language is very difficult. So this actually, the labor, as unclear as the labor laws were in getting to this calculation, this was like actually something very clear compared to like the muddiest things I read in law school. So just figured there was something going on that I wasn't like guessing correctly in my calculations, not something like nefarious happening. So finally figured it out with help from Matt from Australia, and there you go. My records, already changed my records to, you know, pay periods 1, 2, and 3, such that like in my spreadsheet, it's not like I was shorted on overtime hours. It's correct, might be off by like a few pennies, but that doesn't matter. And also changes, I'll bring it up right now, it changes the calculation. I'll update you, because for each pay period I was saying like I was down a few dollars on overtime, but with the tips I was making this much extra. Now I feel like I'm even with all the overtime and everything. So the amount that the tournament tips are adding to my paycheck is an even larger number. The only thing I feel like I was shorted now was my orientation pay, which I just never got because the time on the clock for each pay period has been almost exact. Pay period 1, pay period 2, pay period 3. It's been, I think, a 3-minute difference once, an 11-minute difference once, and an 8-minute difference once. I never got the extra 3 hours for orientation. So started off at like minus 30. I never got orientation pay, but now with all the tournament tips, I feel as though I am up about $1,240 from tournament tips. And yeah, I knew some amount would be coming in, but nothing I could like estimate, nothing I was going to rely on. $1,240 extra from tournament tips than what Orleans guaranteed me, minus 30 from orientation pay. So I feel like I'm like plus $1,210. Even if they said we keep all our tournament tips for the room, we don't give it to dealers, it wouldn't be great on their part because other poker rooms do disperse the tournament tips. I don't know if it's illegal or not, but if the room has the choice, it would just be a bad decision because there's competition in other poker series wanting dealers, and there are other poker series who do it. But if Orleans said that, I mean $15 per down for a no limit hold'em down, $20 per down for a mixed game down, cash tips when you're dealing cash games, and the state minimum wage with some overtime hours in there, it's all still like very solid, and still was going to be more than like that great summer I had 2 summers ago in Council Bluffs. So I would have taken the job anyway. So I feel like I'm like $1,210 ahead, but just letting you know the overtime calculation discrepancy has been solved. And remember, rice is a spoon food.